my dad had a tavern and was very active in the church. So all of those things, maybe for the Irish, just came together. The tavern and the church, it was all, and politics were all just kind of wrapped into one ball, and it meant intermingling with other people and knowing what was going on.
To them, government was very important, and I think one of the reasons was that they saw what a dictatorship could do living under the English, and they were afraid of that. And I think that this idea that government has to be watched by the people was ingrained in their hearts, and that's why politics were so important to them.
When I was growing up, there were politicians that were all around us in Merrill Park, and we could see what that meant to be a politician. We knew that they interacted with the neighbors. We knew that they were always helping people out.
When the railway went bankrupt, they owed him $300, and he was in very bad state financially until he got a job in the police force, and eventually became a police captain in Milwaukee. So that would have been a kind of typical ladder or route of upward mobility for the young Irish coming to Milwaukee in those days.
This is the story of the settlement of the urban Irish in America, with particular emphasis on the early residents of the Merrill Park neighborhood in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Let's begin in Ireland. The history of the Irish in Ireland, particularly during the past 450 years, has been colored by English dominance. The dominance has been clearly political, often economic, and further strained by religious persecution. Throughout the 16th century, the British monarchy seized land in Central Ireland and gave it to English settlers. Roman Catholic services were outlawed, and some bishops and priests were executed. To quell ongoing Irish revolts in Northern Ireland at the end of the century, King James I seized Ulster land and gave it to the Anglican English and Presbyterian Scots. The Irish Catholics resisted, but by 1704 the Catholics, who almost always comprised nearly 90% of the Irish population, held only 1/7 of the land. At that time, Catholics were forbidden to purchase, inherit, or even rent land. Some of these rights would be later restored. In the 1780s, an all-Protestant Irish Parliament reinstated Catholic rights to hold land. However, political rights would not be restored. Over the next nearly 150 years, the Irish Catholics were ruled by an all-Protestant Irish Parliament, or by the British Parliament, with a few representatives from Catholic Ireland. These issues, political oppression, economic dominance, religious persecution, plus the devastating effects of the potato famine of the mid-1840s, led to several waves of Irish immigration to North America. The first of these waves occurred in the 17th century. Here, 50,000 to 100,000, mainly Catholic emigrants, left Ireland. Many of these were forced to leave as convict labor, and many ended up in the West Indies. In the 1660s, 1/5 of the population of the island of Barbados was Irish. The second wave of emigrants left Ireland during the 1700s, when 250,000 Irish arrived in North America. Most of these were Protestants. Most were also economically viable, able to purchase land, and ended up in rural areas. The majority of Irish that settled in U.S. cities came to North America during the third and fourth immigration waves. The third wave occurred in the mid-1840s during the Irish potato famine, when nearly 1 million Irish died on the heels of a potato blight. Here, 2 million mainly Catholic immigrants arrived in North America. Most of these were penniless, unable to purchase land, and ended up seeking jobs in urban areas. The fourth wave of Irish immigration occurred between 1856 and 1921. Here, 3 million mainly Catholic immigrants arrived. This group emigrated primarily to escape political oppression. Also, without resources, these immigrants ended up seeking their subsistence in cities. Irish urban settlements over time took on demeanors of their own. The generally penniless Catholics brought with them many of the cultural traditions of their homeland and their shared memories of domination. The Irish would reconfigure these practices and experiences to help them adapt to life in cities, as well as to life in America in general. The Milwaukee example was in many ways representative of an Irish urban settlement. One of the dominant Irish neighborhoods in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was Merrill Park, an area first settled in the late 19th century. The neighborhood was named after Sherburne S. Merrill, who was the general manager of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad line, later known as the Milwaukee Road.
He lived on 33rd and Wisconsin, although 33rd Street didn't go through. Actually, Merrill Park extends from 30th Street west to 35th Street. That was the Merrill Estate. And subsequently, about 1880, 1890, it was subdivided up into streets. And housing began to be built here about 1890.
The Merrill Park neighborhood, which today is part of Milwaukee's Central City, was originally located just west of the city limits. Sherburne Merrill began developing his estate and a chain of railroad shops that would eventually employ 2,500 people. It was the railroad and available housing that began attracting the Irish to the area. The movement was quickened when a fire in another Irish settlement, Milwaukee's 3rd Ward, prompted the migration of that population to Merrill Park.
The railroads in this country imported or asked people from Germany and from England to come to this country to help in the engineering and mechanicals of the railroad. The first group of people that came here with no skills, possibly in a large group, were the Irish. And they came to the railroads as unskilled and later on became skilled.
The Irish in Merrill Park, like many American urban Irish, organized their lives around certain patterns of practices. In Merrill Park, these practices are summarized as the 4 P's of urban Irish life: parish life, pub life, public political life, and presentation life. Few Irish Catholic communities, in Ireland or in America, prospered without the strong focal point of the local church. In the 1880s, the Irish of Merrill Park founded the St. Rose Parish, named after the first Catholic saint in the Americas. In 1893, the original St. Rose School was built. The parish, and later the school, quickly became the center of Irish community life. The doors of St. Rose are open 24 hours a day, and activities range from Catholic rites to social clubs to classes on living skills to family counseling to youth recreation to neighborhood planning. Parish life became the model for community ideals.
At St. Rose's, we had wonderful young priests. It was usually their first assignment, and they were so spiritually wonderful, but also so sociably fun. If anyone was sick at your house, they'd come and visit you. And then neighbors next door used to have an ongoing Sunday dinner. And all the priests would just stop in and have dinner at Deemer's house.
When I was in first grade, that was the year that St. Rose, the new St. Rose school opened. And we had Sister Susanna, OP, from Cincinnati, Wisconsin, as our first grade teacher. And she taught us to have great reverence and devotion to the Blessed Mother. And we all loved her, loved Sister Susanna because she was a very young and pretty little nun. And when we were in school, we had a May crowning in May, and we crowned the Blessed Virgin. And I've never forgotten that, because after that, we all wanted to be nuns like Sister Susanna. And when we'd go home, we'd have our own May crownings, because she had us have May altars in our home. And we'd borrow our mother's dish towels to put on as veils and walk down our halls. And we'd sing these songs that we sang and had the coronation of the Blessed Virgin at the end of May.
As the model for community ideals, the Catholic parish, with its strong emphasis on the Madonna figure, was also a model for family life among the Irish.
One of the most outstanding features of living your youth in a neighborhood that was predominantly, overwhelmingly predominantly Irish, was the family life. And the family life was centered around the mother. The mother was revered. Every home you went into, the utmost respect was paid to the mother in the family, by the siblings in the family, and by everybody, every young kid that walked into that house. They paid reference to the mother because of this charming and wonderful empathy the Irish have for the figure of motherhood.
The practices associated with parish life often resulted in benefits for the larger community.
One of the very nice things about the Irish coming to Milwaukee is that they always looked after each other. Those that were here already took care of those who were arriving and helped them in whatever way they could. And in those days, in the late 1840s, many of the Irish who came here were impoverished, fleeing famine, some of them suffering from cholera and so on, and they would be left to die on board the ships, or they would be taken to what was called the pest house down on Jones Island, which very often the pest house the doors would be nailed up and they would be left there to die, and then the bodies would be taken to a common grave. But there was some of the women from the Third Ward, which is where the Irish were settling, went on board a ship one day down at Jones Island, and there in the ship they found a family from County Wexford. Their name was Colfer. And the mother and father had died, but their daughter, she was 4 years of age, Kate Colfer, was still alive, lying between her mother and father. So they took young Kate and they brought her up to St. Peter's Church, which is the first Catholic church in Milwaukee and the church which the Irish attended. And Father Morrissey was the priest there, and they brought young Kate to Father Morrissey. And he took her over to St. John's Infirmary, where some Irish nuns had established a hospital. And they took her in. And that became, if you like, the first orphanage in Milwaukee. It became known as St. Rose's Orphanage, a very important institution in the history of Milwaukee. But that young kid, Kate Colfer herself, she went off and became a nun. And some years later, she came back to Milwaukee to work at St. Rose's Orphanage as Sister Martha.
If parish life was the model for community ideals among the Merrill Park Irish, pub life was the guide to social relationships. Sherburne Merrill, who was not Irish himself, had banned all taverns inside the boundaries of Merrill Park. But Irish pubs flourished just outside the neighborhood's boundaries and beyond.
On the east side of 30th Street were, I think, about 5 pubs between 27th, or 5 taverns between 27th and 30th Street, Jim. And then there were several down 30th Street too. And same thing took place on 35th Street. On the east side of 35th Street, there were no taverns, but on the west side of 35th Street, there were several taverns. The pub culture was quite strong here, as the Irish did seek their socialization in the taverns.
Pub life was another import from rural Ireland, with a few new twists. In Ireland, English limits on industrialization and restrictions on the kinds of crops Irish farmers could raise helped create a society in which marriage of the offspring was delayed to provide manual labor for the farm and support for the parents. Without spouses and children of their own, young people had little to do after dark. Many found the local pub a place to relieve loneliness. But in America, marriages were not necessarily delayed. The pub remained a strong focal point for socializing among many urban Irish, but only occasionally after dark.
The tavern was a very important element or part of the way of life in Merrill Park. But I don't want you to get the wrong idea of it. Was there drinking? Of course there was drinking. Was there too much drinking? Sometimes there was it, and that stuff wasn't holy water. But it was an integral part of the society, the web of society, because it was a meeting place, and it was a place where there was interaction between people aside from work. Many of these people worked side by side in railroad yards or in Falk, but and it was normal that they'd come home from work, and on the way home they'd be walking. They'd have their favorite tavern, and they'd stop, and the father might have 2 beers, and he might have a shot, he might have 2 shots, and then he'd go home for supper. Everybody was home for supper.
If one feat distinguished the urban Irish in America, it was their capacity to garner political power. Vulnerable to the English in their homeland, they quickly learned the value of political consolidation here. Organizations, such as the ancient order of Hibernians, flourished as the Irish experienced discrimination in the United States during decades of highest immigration. The role of the Hibernians was to defend the Catholic clergy from outside attack.
We defended the convents in Charlestown, Massachusetts, and other places where they actually burned convents. So we were on call at a moment's notice to protect the priests, the nuns, the religious brothers during them terrible times when no Irish need apply. It was very anti-Irish in the middle of the 1850s, 1860s, when it was very fashionable to be anti-Irish and anti-Catholic. In Boston, it was no Irish need apply. Throughout the United States, it was no Irish, no Catholic need apply.
But the strongest defense for Irish Americans was a potent offense. For over 100 years, the Irish controlled the most powerful political machines in the nation. In Boston, in New York, and in Chicago. The Irish in Merrill Park were no exception.
There were judges and the mayor and officers of the city on citywide levels, other than just the aldermanic level, that would campaign in Merrill Park, because the people in Merrill Park voted. The Irish were very politically aware, and they participated in the elections and voted.
Well, we always voted as a block there. And of course, we always controlled the county government. We had a little trouble with getting a mayor elected in there. But most of the people that worked in the city hall and worked in the county buildings were people from Merrill Park.
Number of people that attained various kinds of public positions, oftentimes civil service positions or otherwise, was very great. Merrill Park turned out a lot of people who were active in the police department, for instance, Captain Croak. There were people who were fire chiefs in the area, and then there were police members who became members of the police department.
In 1/2 century alone, Merrill Park produced nearly 100 judges, district attorneys, and state, county, and city legislators and municipal department heads. During this period, 3 of 4 county executives were Merrill Parkers, and 3 of 4 Milwaukee mayors were raised in the neighborhood.
I remember doing it all, going to the polls and passing out literature for people, and doing literature drops at doors, licking envelopes, working on campaigns, making, as I got older, then I was allowed to make the phone calls, and it was usually always my dad's choice of who that was that we would be interested in. But he'd give us the background, he'd let us know, and he'd tell us his version of who was important and who wasn't important, and we chose to work on these campaigns. So that was always a fun thing to do, and it was a family thing, and it was the kind of thing where we worked together as a family to do these kinds of things. My dad had a tavern, was very active in the church, so it was just part of this thing that we did together. Was you had your spirituality from the church and the religious feelings, and then you had the social things that happened around the tavern, and the politics was just an extension, I think, of both of those kinds of things.
Cultural anthropologists describe Irish Americans as an externally focused people. Unlike more internally driven immigrant groups that overlooked some status markers outside their boundaries, the Irish tended to heed influences both within and outside their communities. This external focus and the twin status markers of the automobile and the house in the suburbs during the middle of the 20th century made it easier for urban Irish communities to disperse geographically. As the Irish gained socioeconomic status, many left their central city neighborhoods for the more isolated outlying areas. But the loss of close proximity did not end cultural life for the urban Irish. The parishes and pubs still brought the community back. Merrill Parkers gathered at least once a month at St. Rose Parish or in Irish pubs to talk about old times. Political life was still the talk of the day. One practice may have actually grown stronger as the community dispersed. This was the Irish presentation life. The pageantry, the poetry, the music, the performance, and the stories that made up the expressive culture of the urban Irish. During Milwaukee's annual ethnic festivals, Irish Fest has consistently drawn one of the largest gates. The Irish Cultural Heritage Center remains a hub of activity.
It began in 1990 when a group of those of Irish ancestry in the city of Milwaukee determined that there was a need for a center which would be a home for the various Irish organizations, for performances, for lectures, for rehearsals. And at that time they began looking for a building that perhaps they could renovate or land that they could buy and build on from scratch. Now in 1995, the group found that the members of the Grand Avenue Congregational Church were looking possibly to disband and searching for a nonprofit organization which could come in, own and operate the building, and allow for the building to continue as a useful part of the city. The building that they owned and operated from since 1887 was on the National Register of Historic Places, and the membership of the church, the members rather, wanted to make absolutely certain that the building didn't fall into disrepair and that certainly it wasn't boarded up. And so the members of the ICHC did agree to purchase the building and did so in December of 1996.
The music, the poetry, the dance, and Irish storytelling often recall the rural past.
Irish stories are always long, you know, because they were told around the fire in the days before television, and a story could last 3 months, you know, start on Monday and continue on Wednesday and continue on Friday and go on for weeks and weeks.
The presentation life remains vital. But what is the future of the urban Irish? What shared vision from the past will continue to bind the community? What, if anything, is now changing?
The Irish in America today are very self-confident, very successful. Recent studies show that the Irish are on average, more successful even than white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, which is kind of new. And this has all happened relatively recently. And it reflects what's going on in Ireland itself, where a booming economy, a tremendous dynamic cultural life, a very self-confident, well-educated, young country. The confidence there is reflected in America, where people nowadays are proud. You know, over 40 million will put down on the census form, "I'm Irish."
They're going to continue to disperse. That's already happening, but I think they will continue to celebrate family, celebrate loyalty, and take pride in their community. One of the things that happens in Milwaukee, and maybe into other Irish communities throughout the United States, there's such a strong celebration of St. Patrick's Day, and it's a time of year where people get together and talk about their heritage and read books and read poetry and dance. My granddaughter is a Irish Trinity dancer, and so all of that comes back to hold everything together. And that's the nice thing, is that the Irish celebrate their culture, and that keeps bringing them together. Also in Milwaukee, we're lucky to have the Irish Fest, where everybody gets to gather again and celebrate culture. But I think that one of the things that really happens is that families, there's a cohesiveness in families with the Irish, where they really care about their other family members, and it's a sense of loyalty, and it's a sense of caring, and I expect that to continue. And like I said, we have several reminders throughout the years, St. Patrick's Day, which makes us all bond, in the Irish Fest, and to make sure that we're at least coming together for those times and talking about our heritage and what role it plays in our past and our future.